On Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting over 900 stations on Pacifica and NPR and college and community stations, public access TV and PBS TV stations, and both TV satellite networks, Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410, Link TV, DirecTV Channel 375 and 348. And our headlines are also available in Spanish for radio stations to take us over 250 are. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest is Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist, professor at Columbia University. His book is out in paperback, Freefall, America, Free Markets, and the Sinking of the World Economy. So just to summarize, you are for a national moratorium on foreclosures.
I think inevitably, I think we have to be moving towards that. And the reason is very simple. There were such the bad practices were so rife, the inequities were so rife, the fraudulent behavior was so common that at this point we don't know what is a valid mortgage and not. And the consequences of throwing somebody out of their home when they shouldn't be, are hard to reverse. I mean, just imagine what it does to the family. The education of their kids are interrupted, what it does to the community. So when we have to balance the injustices, and life is unfortunately always balancing one side versus the other, and where will their mistakes be easily reversed and where not? My view is if we keep them in the homes for a little longer. They owe them money. They still owe the money. That doesn't let them off the hook. But what we're saying is we're not going to speed up this process of where there's a serious risk of an inequity that will not be easily compensated for.
Joe Stiglitz, the deficit, the battle cry of the Tea Party movement, of the Republicans as well. Robert Rubin has weighed in, says any new stimulus plan is highly likely to be counterproductive. What do you think has to happen? Does the deficit matter, and how do you think it should be dealt with?
My view is we cannot afford not to stimulate the economy. So, anybody that says we should go back to austerity or we should not have a second round of stimulus just doesn't understand economics. And let me be very clear about this. If we don't stimulate the economy is going to get weaker. When the economy gets weaker, tax revenues go down and expenditures go up. Already, more than 40 million Americans are on food stamps. The number of people on Medicaid is reaching record levels. So revenues go down, expenditures go up, deficits get worse. If you stimulate the economy, then people get jobs, they spend money, tax revenues go up. Now, if we spend the money on investments in education, technology, infrastructure, you grow the economy in the short run from the stimulus, you grow the economy in the long term because of the returns that you get on these investments. I mean, just think about this as from the point of view of a firm. If you were a firm and you could borrow at 0 to 2.5%, which is what the government can borrow, and you have investment opportunities that yield 10, 15, 20%, you would be irresponsible, you would be foolish not to undertake those investments. So anybody that says, I'm going to only look at one side of the balance sheet, the liabilities, I'm not going to look at the other side, the assets, is really not understanding economics. It's that kind of reasoning that got our country in the trouble in the first place. The people who didn't, short-sighted behavior of the banks that got our country in trouble in the first place. And to me, I just view those kinds of statements as totally irresponsible.
Let me ask you how war fits into this. I mean, you co-wrote the book with Linda Bilmes, The $3 Trillion War. How does war fit into our problems with the economy?
Well, war fits in because you're creating a liability. You're spending money. And when we went to a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we already had a deficit. And so these wars were the first wars in America's history financed totally on the credit card. So you're creating a liability, but you're not creating an asset. So that's the kind of spending that does weaken the economy because it's one-sided. Now, we came out just a couple of weeks ago with new numbers that unfortunately show that our old numbers were a little wrong in the sense that they were too conservative.
$3 trillion.
Was too little. And particularly what we looked at in a report we testified before Congress, what we looked at was the large number of troops returning who are disabled. Turned out that the numbers returning disabled are higher than we had estimated. It's close to 50% now. And the cost per disabled, injured troop is higher. So we had talked then about the cost of health care and disability payments for our returning troops in the order of magnitude a little less than $500 billion. That's a lot of money. Our new numbers are, best estimate, in excess of $900 billion. These are unfunded liabilities, a moral obligation. They fought for us. Unfunded, totally unfunded. The good news is that we're trying to put together a coalition of people who believe in responsible budgeting. They say, okay, if we're going to send our troops overseas, we ought to at least put aside the money to pay for the full-in cost. The full-in costs include the cost of these disabled people.
So what you're estimating the cost of both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan now at?
Well, well in excess of the $3 trillion. Before, the numbers that we said were actually $3 to $5 trillion. That doesn't sound as catchy a title as the $3 to $5 trillion war. The numbers now are much more like $4 to $6 trillion. And
yet across this country, as the debates over, for various congressional and Senate seats, for any seat, whether you're talking about a state one as well, war is almost never raised.
Yeah, I don't understand that, because what should be so clear is that we have a limited amount of resources. And the critics who say we have to worry about the debt are right in emphasizing the economics of scarcity, that we have a limited amount of resources. But the issue isn't whether to cut back. The issue is how we spend our money, because cutting back would weaken the economy. But reallocating our money, more money for those who are unemployed. Remember, we have one of the worst systems of social protection, unemployment insurance of the advanced industrial countries. We are a whole group of people called the 99ers who have come to the end of their unemployment benefits and are being, left to fend for themselves. So what we really need to do is to rethink how we spend the money, make sure that we spend money in a way that will energize our economy. Spending money in Afghanistan, paying money for contractors are not the way to energize our economy and make our economy strong, competitive for the long run.
How much do you think a stimulus should be in this country?
Well, I think we really need $400, $500 billion a year. And part of the reason why we should try to keep those kinds of numbers in mind is to realize that we have a federal system. About a third of all spending is at the state and local level. And the states have balanced budget frameworks, which mean when the revenues go down, they have to cut back spending or raise taxes, very difficult in the current environment. And their revenues are going down. They depend very heavily on property taxes. Values of real estate have gone down 30%, 40%, in some places 50%. And the result of this is that we're laying off teachers. We're laying off those who provide basic services. So while the government is coming to the end, the federal government's coming to the end of the stimulus, the states are retracting. We saw that in the September numbers on jobs. 67,000 private sector jobs were created. Not enough for the new entrants in the labor force, so less than half the amount we needed. But we lost in total 95,000 jobs. In other words, there was about 140,000 loss in the public sector, predictable. I talk about that in my book. Predictable, unless we find some ways of making up for their shortfall.
And you say the stimulus would do that.
If we have another stimulus, it could do that.
So why don't you think President does that, even in his own interest? I mean, when you see the Democrats falling all over the country, what looks like the predictions for this election.
You know, I said that that's what we should have done in the first round of stimulus because it was so clear where we were going.
So who's not listening to you? President Obama, Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers now gone.
I think, you know, let me be frank, I think what happened is that some of these people who helped create the crisis, who, you know, were in favor of the deregulation, who didn't do their job regulating the banks that they should have done.
Naming names here.
Well, you can figure out who those are.
You tell us.
Well, Geithner was the head of the New York Federal Reserve Board, whose responsibility is overseeing New York banks.
Secretary, Timothy Geithner.
And we know Larry Summers was, you know, his great achievement was passing the law that deregulated, make sure that derivatives, these risky securities that led to the downfall of AIG costing $180 billion, his great achievement was to make sure that this was not regulated. Not regulated as a gambling product, not regulated as an insurance product, not regulated as securities. Well, having created these problems, they had an incentive, quite frankly, to try to say this is, you know, the problems are not that deep. All we have to do is fix the banking system. You know, there's been an accident. Who could have predicted this? And the answer is a lot of us did. But it was something that happened to the banking system rather than something the banking system did to us. So their incentive, this is a problem of accountability, their incentive was to try to say, okay, we've had an accident, we put the banks into the hospital, we give them a little money, let's not try to interfere how they spend the money because that's not the way we do things, so that they could take that money rather than recapitalize, give it out in bonuses or dividends. But we just put it in the hospital for a couple of years, and meanwhile we have this moderate size stimulus, but then a year and a half later, 2 years later, the banks have recovered and we go back to where we were before 2007. Well, reality is that the economy was sick before that, and you can't go back to 2007. And how we're at the end of the 2 years, it's so clear that the economy is not back to health, and that 2-year stimulus was too small, not well enough designed, and we're left in the situation that we have today, where the economy clearly continues to be sick. Not in the sense that the banks are making profits again, Wall Street is not doing badly, but sick in the real sense. 1 out of 6 Americans who would like a full-time job cannot get one. That is a sick economy, in my mind.
Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. His book, Freefall, is just out in paperback, subtitled America, Free Markets, and the Sinking of the World Economy. So let's go to the world economy. There have been a wave of protests across Europe against the so-called austerity measures and budget cuts in several European countries. In France, workers are striking for the 7th straight day over pension reform. In Britain, the government's preparing to reveal the biggest program of budget cuts in decades. Unions held a rally in London Tuesday to protest the cuts.
These cuts will lose over 1 million jobs. And let's be clear, this is not an economic necessity, but a political choice that they're making.
It's absolutely crucial at the moment that we don't allow our public sector to be assassinated and decimated, not just because public services will be affected, but because the whole of our country's economy will be maybe leading for a double-dip recession. We may not recover for many years to come.
That's Britain. Your response, Joe Stiglitz.